I've always been a cat person. We never had animals when I was a kid. Allergies, my mother claimed, but I had my doubts after seeing her chase squirrels out of our garden with a broom and gleefully set traps for mice, and even more gleefully emptying them out afterwards. When I was little, I was given soft toy kittens to play with and told they were better than the real thing because they didn't need to poop in trays. But even back then, I couldn't be convinced that cats weren't the best thing ever. Something about the way they were soft and fluffy, but entirely aware of their own worth and willing to enforce their boundaries really appealed to me. I might have a few mommy issues now that I think about it. I would always divert my walk home from school to pass by a neighbor's house and stroke their ancient tabby, who loved to sun himself on the stoop. When a couple across the street adopted a calico from the local shelter, I stood by their gate like I was doing an impression of the Exorcist poster, hoping to catch a glimpse of that lithe body slipping out of the cat flap to explore its domain. Mr. Freckles, a wily old tomcat who patrolled the streets like he owned them, never let me pet him, but would wait on the wall at the end of my street for me to pause and talk to him like he could understand me. Cats were everything I was not. Where I was dumpy, they were sleek. Where I was graceless, they oozed elegance. Where I took everything to heart and the slightest criticism could reduce me to tears, they looked down on the world as something that owed them a charmed existence. When the gawkiness of a teenage body took a stranglehold, I modeled myself on cats and trained myself not to care what others thought of me. I imagined myself with a swishing tail behind me, communicating my displeasure with people who talked down to me, and that allowed me to better conceal my feelings on my face. When I hit adulthood and my mother's 18th birthday present was telling me I now had to pay rent for a privilege of living in my childhood bedroom, my first act of independence was to seek out an apartment that allowed pets and install a feline companion alongside my computer and books. While the other college students were out partying, I liked nothing better than to curl up with a Charlotte Bronte or a Mary Shelley while stroking a purring ginger bundle. Of course, one cat soon became two, with the reasoning that they could keep each other company while I was at class or my part-time job. The local shelter was practically begging people to adopt cats that they had already spayed or neutered, since they were always at capacity. It was a kindness, really. So 2 became 3, then 4. And by the time I finally got my dream job at the publishing house, I would come home each night to 8 different meows for food and fusses. I suppose you could say that my goal in life was to become a crazy cat lady, in which case, I guess I peaked early. There is a very fine line between corkily unique and don't ask for your ball back from her garden or she'll kidnap you and cook you into a stew. I can't lie. I prefer to be left alone with my books and my cats. At work, I was in charge of reading manuscripts submitted by eager agents and sifting through the slush pile of unsolicited agentless submissions. Most were dreck, and sometimes I got asked if I wouldn't like to move onto the main floor, or PR, or one of the other manifold departments, but I clung to my solitude the way kittens cling to curtains. Dates? I had a few. I even brought a couple home. I found myself without a preference, so men and women crossed the threshold to be subjected to the kitty test. How could I even consider being with someone who didn't like cats? I must be really bad at picking up potential partners, though, because not one of them passed. One guy even told me at the end of the evening that they freaked him out. I mean, seriously? What kind of self-respecting man gets freaked out by a few cats? He would be better off modeling himself on one of my toms. They didn't take shit from anyone. Okay, so maybe it was more than a few cats. More than 8. A lot more. It wasn't my fault, though. Strays in the area gravitated to my house since they could be sure of food and a warm, safe place to sleep. I loved every new addition. There were losses, too, and whether they had been with me for 3 years or 3 days, each death was treated with the same amount of grief. I remember one queen who struggled through the cap flap, heavily pregnant and horrifically thin. She lasted just long enough to give birth, and then faded away with her head on my best cushion. I worked from home while I bottle-fed the 4 scraps of fluff she had entrusted to my care. The age of the internet, work from home, and flexible hours meant I could import digital copies of manuscripts to reject. I have very clear memories of sitting by the glow of a laptop screen until the wee hours, I scanning a particularly badly written sex scene involving whips, chains, and clogs of all things, while milk-sated kittens dozed in a blanket on my lap. I don't know why so many people want to write the next 50 Shades of Grey. The originals were terrible, and the dollar store versions in the publisher's slush pile were much, much worse. But I'm getting off track. You're not here to listen to me ramble about E.L. James and her total inability to write. Grosvenor was special. He came and went for years, sometimes staying with me for a long while, sometimes disappearing for months, during which I genuinely thought he was dead. I named him after a character in one successful novelist's submission, a piratical swashbuckler with brains, bronze, and a liking for women. Any queens who lived with me were spayed, but more than one young stray in the area bore such a striking resemblance that they could only be Grosvenor's offspring. Unusually for a committed stray, he liked to perch on my shoulder and purr into my ear as I went about my work. He was a big Tom and weighed me down, but the warm mass of rumbling fuzz was too comforting to mine a few sore muscles. I got used to working primarily with one hand while he was around, the other constantly sneaking up to scratch his ears. Sometimes it felt like he was reading the screen along with me, passing judgment on desperate wannabe authors. He growled when I read E.L. James wannabes. He even drank tea. That always stuck with me. No other cat I ever looked after liked tea, but I often find Grosvenor with his face in my half-empty mug. He would stare up at me, clear challenge in his eyes, brown droplets dripping off his whiskers, until I laughed and went to make a fresh cup for myself. He liked his tea warm, with a splash of full cream milk. When he was around, I found myself buying skimmed for myself and a pint of whole milk for his needs. It wasn't a conscious decision. I looked down at my basket at the supermarket, realized it was there, and shrugged before paying and leaving. He was worth the extra expense. I loved that cat. I loved all of them, of course, but I had a special place for Grosvenor. He had this little stitch of white fur under his chin, 3 identical swirls, the only bit of white on his whole black body. I would scratch it sometimes to hear that special purr he reserved for that particular spot. The skin beneath was raised, and what I presumed was scar tissue from a past battle was something that had gone for his throat. He was covered in scars and missing the tips of both ears from old scuffles over territory and mating rights in the area. Once, he had came to me with a very clear break in his tail. It hung limply behind him, caked in dirt and blood where bone had broken the skin. Though he hissed and spat, he allowed me to pick him up and carry him to the vet. I remember his sullen face after they amputated everything below the break, glaring at me from a cage in the back room of the vet's surgery. The vet recommended that he stay indoors for a few weeks after that. But after a mere 6 days, I found the window prized open by ingenious paws and a tuft of his fur caught on the latch. He returned that evening, as if he knew my house was the best place for him while he healed. The next day, though, I saw several Toms in the area who had grown too bold in his absence, all with limps and new scratches to remind them of their place. Mrs. Mitchin was my polar opposite in all ways. Where I was fat, she was rail thin. Where I was kind, she was cruel. Where I was just getting by, she boasted of her sizable payout she got from her husband's death. Where I was insular, she was a loudmouth who always stuck her nose in everyone else's business. And where I liked cats, she hated them. Truth be told, I think she hated all animals. She reminded me of my mother in that way. I often saw her from my bedroom window, over the fence that divided our properties, running at birds with a broom to make them fly away if they dared to land in her yard. Not many birds tried. Her yard was horrible. She had concreted over everything, making her aesthetic like a tiny microcosm of a gray post-apocalyptic wasteland from one of those many dystopian novels that had landed in the slush pile when Hunger Games and Divergent were popular. My yard, by contrast, had been allowed to grow wild, to give shelter to stray cats who weren't yet ready to brave coming inside my house, but needed food and a place to go when it stormed. Whirls of greenery covered everything, punctuated by bursts of color from flowers I never remembered planting, but which speared up from the soil every springtime. More than once, Miss Mitchin knocked on my front door to complain about my yard. I say knocked, but I really mean banged so hard with her fist that she nearly gave me a heart attack. I tried to respond calmly and politely, but it's hard when someone is screaming in your face with barely any pauses for you to get a word in. Mostly, I just stood there and let her rant, told her that I hoped she felt better now, and then shut the door on her face. I had read my city's bylaws. We didn't live in an HOA. My yard didn't break any rules. There was nothing she could do about it except yell at me and occasionally call animal control officers that all the stray cats already knew how to avoid. Or so I thought. None of the cats in our area went anywhere near that horrible woman's yard. They didn't even sit on the fence between our properties. She exuded such hatred that they probably sensed it and stayed away. Cats are excellent judges of character. If a cat chooses you, you're undoubtedly a good person. If they keep their distance, or hiss, or avoid you, well, let's just say I'd probably cross the street away from you too. But Grosvenor, he was the king of the neighborhood. And no broomstick-wielding old harridan with a Botoxed forehead was going to stop him walking along the fences, staring into his domain. Whenever she saw him, she ran outside to shriek like a banshee and throw whatever she had to hand, trying to knock him off. Sometimes I found things that missed and landed in my yard. Balled-up junk mail, small stones, old burnt candles, and even cans of unopened food. Who sees a regal tomcat on their fence and thinks, I know, I'll launch these barbecue beans at him? Is it any wonder why I called her Mrs. Bitchin in private? Not even his bandaged tail was enough to soften her reactions at the sight of him. When he escaped midway through what should have been his convalescence, I spotted him walking the fence, struggling more than usual to balance, but defiant enough not to surrender. I should have nailed his escape window shut after he came back that first time. I should have put him in a crate. I should have done something to keep him inside while he should have been resting. He was a strong, defiant cat, but even the strongest of us sometimes need others to tell us when to stop taking risks while we're in a weakened state and might not be able to get them out. I know it was Mrs. Bitchin who did it. I don't know how. It seems impossible to me, even now, but I know it was her. I was deep in catching up with my emails at the kitchen table when one of my more sensitive younger cats came howling into the room. She was followed by several others, all tugging at my pant legs and darting between me and the door, calling me to come and look at something. I followed, intrigued by what could have pulled them all into such a frenzy. That intrigue quickly turned into horror when I saw the ragged bundle of black fur on my porch. Grosvenor had dragged himself as far as he could before his little body gave out. He was dying. I could tell that right away, and with his failing strength he had come to me. I didn't think he thought I could save him, but I was the one human who had ever showed him love, and he chose to die surrounded by that love instead of in the street like a piece of meaningless trash the city would have to clean up. I took him to the vet, even though, on some level, I knew it was too late. Poison, the vet told me. They'd had a spate of stray cats with similar symptoms being brought in recently. The vet suspected foul play, but there was no way to prove it. Sometimes evil people thought they were justified in doing things like lacing meat with antifreeze before putting it out for hungry strays, or spraying cats with household chemicals, knowing they would lick themselves clean and die as a result. It made my heart heavy, and my brain fire with so much fury that the moment I had finished signing the payment forms to have Grosvenor cremated, I drove home and went to bang on Mrs. Bitchin's front door. She wouldn't answer. Guilt oozed out between the wooden clapboards of her house. She never refused an excuse to talk to someone on her doorstep. She loved yelling at people too, and I was spoiling for a fight. For once, I wanted to yell right back at her, but that bitch wouldn't even give me that satisfaction. Instead, she stayed inside, hiding from me, knowing that I knew what she had done. When I finally marched away, stiff-legged with rage, I saw her curtains twitch and a brief flash of a satisfied smirk at her window. I'd never hated someone before. I didn't even know I was capable of hatred, but I hated that woman. The hatred boiled and roiled inside of me until it felt like I had swallowed a hot coal and it was burning a path through my guts, into my veins, down my hands, until I felt like I could press them against the wall of her house and scorch my way inside. She had taken away my Grosvenor, and who knew how many other poor strays, and I would never, ever forgive her for that. I cried for him. I'm not ashamed to admit that. That night, I sobbed myself to sleep. A few of my own precious cats snuggled against me, trying to give me comfort in my hour of need, and I appreciated their efforts, but somehow having them there made it especially clear to me that Grosvenor wasn't, and wasn't ever going to be again. I thought of his cold little body on that vet's table, bagged and tagged to be taken to the animal crematorium the next day, and cried all the more. I dreamed of him. In my dream, he crawled in through the window that he had used to escape and meowed lustily, thrusting his head into my hand for his usual scritches. Dream logic took over, and I could understand him as if he was actually speaking to me. He reassured me that he was fine, that he didn't hurt anymore, and that his legacy would carry on with all the kittens he had fathered. It was a simple way of looking at things, but the simplicity of cats was one of the things I liked most about them. Still, I was perturbed by the thought of innocent kittens meeting the same fate Grosvenor had, especially since he was not the only cat to die of poisoning in the neighborhood. I voiced this to him and felt no surprise that he could understand me as well as I could understand him. Dream logic was a wonderful thing. He assured me that he knew who had caused those deaths, and that he would take care of the perpetrator. Then he curled on my chest and purred like a rusty train engine. And when I woke up, my chest ached, but in a good way this time, as if it had been compressed all night by a happy cat sleeping on it. My heart still ached with grief, but the dream had brought me some comfort, and I went about my morning routine, feeding my cats and then myself, before sitting at my laptop with an enormous mug of coffee to glance over my morning emails. I became aware of the commotion around lunchtime. At first, the wail of the ambulance was just part of the usual background noises that accompanied living in suburbia, but when it got louder, I realized it had parked in my street. The noise set my cats to wailing, and I went to the front window to see what was going on. 2 men in EMT uniforms were just disappearing into the house next door, where a woman I vaguely recognized from the family down the street was wringing her hands and crying off her mascara and ugly black streaks. One of my young tomcats with a patch of white under his chin hopped up on my shoulder, and I absently scratched his ear as I watched the drama unfold. One paramedic came to speak to the crying woman, who stayed on the porch until a police car had arrived with siren blaring. By now, several other people on the street were at their windows or rubbernecking blatantly at their front doors. We were all captivated. Nothing like this had ever happened on our sleepy street. So when a body bag was later brought out on a stretcher and police strung crime scene tape around the house, we all saw it. A policewoman with a blonde ponytail and a nasally voice came by later on to ask whether I had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. I told her that I hadn't, whereupon the crying woman on the porch pointed at me and yelled that this was clearly my doing, and that everyone had seen me banging on Mrs. Mitchen's door and yelling at her yesterday. I admitted that I had done that, but maintained that no one had answered, that I had gone home, and that I had neither seen or heard a single thing out of the ordinary until the ambulance arrived. I pointed to the security cameras on Mrs. Mitchen's wall and my own Ring doorbell, telling the officer to check her footage and mine to corroborate my story. She said that she would and thanked me for my time, but didn't seem very interested in questioning me further. In truth, she seemed like an overworked public servant who just wanted to get out of there and go back to the precinct and eat another donut already. Newspapers reported that Mrs. Angela Mitchen had been found dead by a member of her sewing circle who got concerned when she didn't turn up for their weekly meeting. The stories were lurid, as most local papers are to be to sell copies. The reporters described, in an act of supreme yellow journalism, that her face had been almost unrecognizable, scored through the deep scratches that popped both eyeballs, split her tongue, and reached down to her throat, where one had opened her jugular. The wounds looked like the result of a wild animal attack, but all doors and windows in the house had been locked from the inside, and the security footage to her house and others in the neighborhood showed that no one had entered her house or left her house at any point between when I stood on that porch to when her sewing circle buddy arrived to look for her. The only clue the coroner had were 4 odd bruises on her chest, evenly spaced, as if a 4-legged object of great weight had pressed hard on her skin as it achieved lividity. Or some animal had stood on her, watching her die. There were a lot of black kittens with tiny white swirls of fur under their chins this year. Grosvenor's descendants were growing up well, safe from the threat that took their father from me. I like watching them grow up, seeing which parts of his personality passed on into the next generation of street cats. Some of them have already started sniffing around my house, as if drawn here by some unseen force, telling them that it's safe, I am kind, and they can be sure of love and a good life here with me. So I leave you with this thought, dear reader. Be kind to cats, even if you're not a cat person, even if you don't like strays in your neighborhood, even if you have allergies or fear them or something else. Still be kind. You see, cats are funny creatures. If they like you, they will be your companion for life. And if they love you, they will stay with you even beyond that. But if you're cruel, if you try to hurt them, if you take time out of your long human life to make their short feline lives unpleasant for your own selfish reasons, well, let's just say that cats have a way of making sure we humans know our place as their inferiors, and that there is a reason why ancient Egyptians worshipped them as gods with strange, unknowable powers.